the next thing obviously we need to look at is the snare drums, and I'm going to take just one snare drum to look at this, and it's the snare drum from this track. And in the drop. And here it is on its own. So again, I'm going to go through 3 tips for getting good snare drums. I'm sure again you're all laying up samples for your snare drums, and I guess my tip for snare drums is, my first one is that when you're layering up samples, you want to make sure that they're all sort of in there for a different reason, or they're doing something different. And when you decide they're doing something different, you know, change some parameters accordingly. And so what I mean by that, and I use battery for this as well, because it's just got everything you need, and it's got all your envelopes, and it's got some effects and everything in there. So, you know, everything that I need to manipulate the drum sound is right in there. So when you think about your snare drums, let's just loop that. You can see which ones are playing here. And you can see, you know, there's one for the low end, one for the high end, one for a clap sound, it's kind of a wide clap sound, one for a more of a transient clap sound like that. And so, you know, just think about when you're layering up your snares, try and, you know, layer different kinds of sounds together. And when you load them in, think about, first of all, the envelope. So, you know, say you've got like 4 sounds layered up for a snare drum, maybe only have 1 or 2 of them that have the attack set to minimum. On the other ones, like I've done in here, you know, fade in the attack, because otherwise you're just going to get a huge sounding transient at the beginning of your snare drum, and it's going to sound a bit too like it's cutting through. Also, you know, I'll get some sounds sometimes in there. I'll sometimes put a really long attack on some snare layer sounds, because it gives like a sort of a real sort of sucking through the snare sound. And then, so you set your envelope, then make sure you set up your EQ so that it's just not clashing with anything. And in battery here, you've got the EQ built in. Yeah, there you go. So I've taken out the top end of that and taken out the bottom end of that. So yeah, just think about what frequencies you need from that particular sound, and just, you know, take out the others. And then also, once you've put a sound in there with a snare sound, just change, you know, think about changing the timing of it, especially with clap sounds. You want them to hit just before or after the kick drum. That can make so much of a difference. So when you go into the MIDI part itself, you can just zoom right in. You see there, I've just like done a minor adjustment on this clap sound here, because that can make a world of difference between the kick drum and the snare sound relationship. My second tip for snare drums is to use some parallel processing. And this, like, you know, when you know, there's a whole bunch of compressors out there that you could use, and, you know, there's so many that it's not, you know, it's not easy to say, all right, this compressor you have to use for this. But I will say it, for snare drums, that this compressor, not necessarily this one, but the hardware that this is based on is the DBX 160, and that is like the mother compressor for snare drums, and sometimes kick drums too, but snare drums. If you want a fat sounding snare, run it through 160 and run it in parallel as well, because this really likes, this really gives you the really crunchy transient on your kick drum. I'm just going to solo it so you can hear what it's doing. If I make it more extreme. Okay, that's a really extreme setting there. You can hear it just, this really accentuates the transient of your of your snare drum, and in a really nice way. So this is the one time I think I'll say, yes, definitely use this model of compressor on this sound. And it's actually, this one has got a dry knob, but for some reason I've just put it into a rack to run it parallel. But yeah, definitely running this parallel on your snare drums is a great thing to do. Another plugin that I also run parallel on snare drums, and I think I've done it on this one here. Because obviously with the 160, what you're doing is you're sort of mixing in some of the, you're really isolating the transient and then mixing that in to give it more punch. Other times you might want to do opposite, and you might want to just make a snare sound a bit more driven and larger. So in that case, I'll generally run it through something which really sort of destroys it. And my favorite plugin for that is this one. It's basically it's just a sort of compressor and audio level destroy is what it says. It literally destroys anything you put through it. But without it, there's not much sustain. Just, I want something that lasts a bit longer in the mix. Yeah, Devil Lock from Sound Toys. On its own, so you can hear it pretty much destroys the transient, but it really brings up the sustain, like it basically really crunches it. So a little bit of that in parallel with the snare drum can really bring up sort of the end of the snare drum in a really fat way. So those basically my two favorite sort of parallel processing for snare drums. Sometimes I'll use, some EQ and transient shaping and distortion, but those are my two sort of favorite tools. My third tip for snare drums is to obviously use some reverb on them. How do I do that? I create a rack like this, and I use generally two different reverbs on my snare drums. The first one, I always use this plugin, this Valhalla Roon plugin. The reason why is because it's got this separate sections for the early and late reflections of the reverb, and you can use this slider to set it only to the early reflections, and then you can use this knob here just to set the size of the early reflections. So when you set it in this mode, all you're getting is like a short burst of early reflections, and that's it, no more reverb. So you just send your snare drum to a little bit of this. It's got a knob here, this early crosser one, which controls the stereo spread, and just a little bit of this adds some real life to your snare drum. So always on my snare drum, I will just add a little bit of only early reflection reverb. I'm not sure, there must be other reverb plugins out there where you can just do early reflections, but I'm not sure which ones. I use this one. It's really cheap to buy as well. And it sounds really good. So I will set my early reflection on the snare drum first. I don't know if you're going to be able to hear the difference in here. Well, I will try it and play it to you. Probably can't hear that in here. But if you try that in a studio, you would be able to just mix it in until you just notice the effect, and that's probably the right level. And then after that, I will add an actual proper room reverb set. So this is just some kind of standard room reverb. You could even just go into the preset menu to start off with, select, I think, the studio room or something like this. Some kind of room reverb setting, and then I'll add a bit of that in as well.